Under the blinding sun of the Arizona Territory, the dust never settled. It hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave, carrying whispers of anger, hunger, and fear. Out here, in a land where mercy was scarce and survival demanded a hard heart, even kindness could become a sin. The woman kneeling by the well knew this better than anyone. Her hands trembled as she poured the last of her cornmeal into a clay bowl. Pushing it toward, the figure slumped against the adobe wall, a starving Apache warrior, his ribs showing through sunburned skin. The village had been quiet that morning, too quiet. Children stayed indoors, and men gathered near the church, muttering in low voices about raids and cattle gone missing. But when she saw the Apache fall near her gate, she didn't think of the raids or the warnings. She thought only of the man's eyes, tired, hollow, and human. She fed him a little bread. She gave him water. She even whispered a prayer over him, asking the Lord for forgiveness if she was wrong. But kindness in this part of the country was a dangerous thing. Someone saw her. By evening, word spread through the small settlement like wildfire. Men left their supper, grabbing stones from the ground as they gathered near her house. The church bell rang once, a hard metallic sound that carried through the valley, calling everyone to witness what they thought was justice. The Apache had crawled away by then, dragging himself toward the mountains. But she was still there, caught between fear and faith. A man from the village. Farmer, with dust on his hat and fury in his eyes, was the first to throw a stone. It struck her shoulder, making her stumble. Another followed, and another, until the crowd's anger echoed louder than the wind. No one spoke for her. No one stepped forward. Even the pastor turned away, whispering that she had brought shame to the settlement. She didn't cry. She only covered her face and prayed they'd stop before her unborn child felt the pain she did. When the stones stopped, the villagers turned their backs, leaving her kneeling in the dirt beside the torn edge of her skirt. That night, thunder rolled across the desert. The next morning, the sun rose blood-red over the hills. The wind carried an unfamiliar sound, distant hooves, many of them. The people thought it was thunder again, or maybe cattle running wild, till they saw the first silhouettes appear on the ridge. Riders, dozens of them. Their hair long and dark, their faces painted, their horses restless under the rising heat. The Apache had returned. The woman, bruised and weak, stood at the edge of the village, her shawl clutched tight. Her eyes found the same warrior she had helped, now upright and proud on horseback. His gaze met hers, and for a moment time froze between them. The villagers panicked, grabbing their rifles, shouting for the women and children to hide. But she didn't move. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the sand. The others waited behind him, silent as the grave. The woman tried to speak, to warn the people, to beg for peace, but the farmer who had thrown the first stone shouted at her again, calling her a traitor. He raised his gun toward the Apache, hands shaking. Before he could fire, the warrior lifted his hand. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Why? The woman whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. The Apache looked at her, his face unreadable beneath the dust and scars. He spoke something in his language, low and heavy like thunder before a storm and turned to his men. They began to move. The villagers scrambled, the sound of hooves and fear filling the air. Horses kicked up dust that blinded the sky, and the air thickened with tension. The woman fell to her knees again, covering her ears as shouts and gunfire broke out across the square. But through the chaos, she saw something strange. The Apache warrior wasn't attacking the weak. His people weren't burning the homes. They were searching for something, or someone, and then she understood. They weren't there for the village. They were there for the man who had thrown the stone. She turned toward the churchyard, where he had fled, clutching his rifle. Her heart raced as she realized that the act of cruelty that nearly killed her was now about to decide everyone's fate. The Apache were not savages to him anymore. They were justice made flesh, riding down from the mountains like spirits of vengeance. The woman tried to run, her bare feet sinking into the dust, shouting for them to stop, but her voice was lost in the noise. She stumbled through the smoke and confusion until she reached the square again. The Apache warrior stood near the church steps now, the farmer before him, trembling. "You fed me," the warrior said softly to the woman, his English rough but clear. "He threw stones." She shook her head, tears cutting through the dirt on her face. "Please, don't." But mercy was a word too fragile for the desert. Behind the warrior, his tribe waited, their faces hard as the mountains. The farmer fell to his knees, begging the same way she had. And for a moment, it seemed like the world had turned upside down, victims and sinners changing places in the same sun-baked square. The woman stepped forward, her hands raised, her voice breaking. "If you kill him, you'll be no different than them," she cried. The Apache warrior's eyes softened, just for an instant. He looked at Herat, the life she carried, at the courage in her voice. Then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. The wind died down. The other riders hesitated, unsure. But peace was a fragile thing, easily broken by fear. A gunshot cracked the air. The woman gasped as smoke drifted from behind her. The farmer had fired again, striking the Apache's shoulder. Everything erupted at once. The horses reared. Men shouted. The tribe charged forward like a storm unleashed. The woman fell to the ground, clutching her belly, screaming for it all to stop as the world around her became a blur of dust, hooves, and fury. Through the haze, she saw the Apache warrior fighting to stay upright, blood staining his side. He caught sight of her through the chaos, his expression filled with something she could never name, part anger, part sorrow, part gratitude. And then he vanished into the storm. The sun began to sink behind the mission's walls, painting the sky with fire. Smoke curled upward, carrying the cries of men and the echoes of what could never be undone. By nightfall, the village was silent again. Only the wind moved through the empty streets, whispering over the stones. The woman lay beside the well, where it had all begun, her face turned toward the stars. She didn't know if the Apache were gone or if they'd return. She didn't know if the man who'd hurt her still lived. All she knew was that mercy in this land came at a cost. And somewhere in the distance, under the starlit ridges, a wounded Apache warrior rode back toward the mountains, leaving behind a village that would never forget the day. Kindness met vengeance under the same sun. The story of what happened that day would spread, twisted and retold. Some would say she'd betrayed her people. Others would whisper she saved them. But only she would remember the truth, that it all began with a single act of compassion, and a man too blind with hate to see its worth. And as dawn crept over the desert again, painting the sand gold and red, the sound of a single horse echoed far off on the horizon, rising like a promise, or a warning carried on the wind. The following morning brought no peace to the village. Only the heavy silence that comes after fear has settled into the bones of men. The sun rose slow and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the square where ashes still marked the ground. A few burnt fences, scattered belongings, and an overturned water barrel were all that remained of the night's chaos. The people moved quietly, eyes down, whispering prayers that no one dared to speak aloud the day before. The woman stood near the well again, the same place where it had all begun. Her hands trembled as she poured water into a bucket, each drop echoing in the hollow space between her and the people who once called her neighbor. They looked at her differently now, not with anger, not yet, but with something worse, fear. She had become a reminder of what kindness could cost. Her small house stood on the edge of town, where the open desert met the dry scrubland. The walls were cracked and the roof sagged from years of windstorms, but it was home. Inside, she lit a candle and sat near the window, staring out toward the mountains. The horizon shimmered with heat, and she wondered if the Apache were still out there watching. For days she barely spoke. The people avoided her, crossing the street when she passed. The man who had thrown the first stone had disappeared since the attack. Some said he fled into the hills, others whispered he was taken by the Apaches that night. No one knew for certain, and no one went looking. The preacher came once, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. His voice was low, heavy with words that felt rehearsed. He told her that sometimes good intentions lead to sorrow, that she should seek forgiveness for stepping outside her place. But as he spoke, He couldn't meet her eyes. When he left, she watched him walk down the dirt road, his shadow stretching long behind him. For the first time, she felt truly alone. That evening, she went behind the house to tend the small patch of corn she'd managed to keep alive. The ground was hard and dry, but the rhythm of work steadied her hands. As she dug her fingers into the earth, she found something half buried near the fence, a small feather, black with red tips. It was tied with a thin strip of leather. Her breath caught. She knew what it meant. The Apache had been here. She glanced toward the desert again, her heart pounding. The air was still, too still. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. For a moment, she thought she saw movement near the ridge, a flash of silver, a glint of something alive. But when she blinked, it was gone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound made her flinch, the rustle of wind against the shutters, the creak of old wood. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat near the fire, listening. The memory of the Apache warrior's face wouldn't leave her mind. There had been no hate in his eyes, not even when he stood among his tribe. Only pain. And she wondered if he was still bleeding somewhere out there, alone like she was. The next morning, the sheriff arrived. He was a tall man with a worn hat and a voice rough from too many years of shouting orders. He questioned her about the night of the raid, asking what she saw, what she knew. His tone wasn't cruel, but there was suspicion buried beneath it. "Some folks think they came for you," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "You gave one of them food. Maybe they took it as a promise." She shook her head. "No promise. Just pity. Pity's dangerous out here," he said. "Men die for less." He tipped his hat and left, but his words stayed long after the sound of his boots faded. By noon, a dust storm swept through, hiding the mountains behind a curtain of gold and gray. The village huddled indoors, windows shut tight. But when the wind settled, the woman saw something at the edge of her field, a figure standing, motionless against the setting sun. It was him, the Apache warrior. He stood tall, his long hair whipped by the wind, his skin pale beneath the fading light. The wound on his shoulder was wrapped in cloth darkened by dried blood. He didn't move toward her, nor did he raise a weapon. He simply watched, like a spirit waiting to be seen. Fear and relief battled inside her. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. "You shouldn't be here." His reply was calm, carried softly by the wind. "You saved me," she swallowed hard. "And now they think I betrayed them." He looked past her, toward the village rooftops. "They threw stones." She nodded slowly. "They're afraid." He said nothing, but his eyes told her he understood. The world between them was one of loss and misunderstanding, two sides of the same desert, both haunted by what they had to do to survive. Before she could speak again, he turned away, walking toward the hills. She wanted to call after him, to ask what he wanted, but her voice failed her. Only his tracks remained in the sand, leading back toward the mountains. Days passed. The villagers grew restless, speaking of revenge. The sheriff gathered men to form a patrol, promising to bring back proof that the Apache threat was gone for good. The woman stayed inside, afraid of what more blood would bring. She prayed for peace, but peace never lasted long in the territory. One night, she awoke to the sound of hooves again. At first, she thought it was the patrol returning, but when she opened her window, she saw torches moving along the ridge, slow, deliberate. Too many for a scouting party? The Apache were watching the village once more. The people didn't know it yet, but something was coming. She could feel it in the air, the stillness before a storm, the kind that changes everything. She lit her lamp and sat by the door, staring at the feather she had found. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a message she didn't yet understand. Somewhere beyond the hills, the wounded warrior rode again, carrying the memory of the woman who had fed him when no one else would. But the desert was full of secrets, and mercy had a long echo in a land built on vengeance. As dawn approached, the first rider from the patrol returned. His horse was exhausted, its flanks streaked with blood. The man could barely speak, his face pale as dust. He dismounted in the square, collapsing to his knees. "They're coming!" he gasped. Hundreds of them. The crowd gathered, panic rising. Women cried out. Men shouted orders. The sheriff tried to calm them, but his voice was lost in the noise. The woman stood at her door, frozen. The horizon glowed faintly red with the light of the coming day and beyond it. The faint echo of drums carried through the wind, the same drums that had haunted her. Dreams since the night she fed the dying warrior, somewhere in that vast desert. He was leading them back, not for conquest, not for plunder, but for something deeper, something tied to what had been taken, to what could never be forgotten. And as the first rays of sun spilled across the sand, she knew the past was riding toward her again, swift as the desert wind. Unstoppable as fate, the people prepared their guns. The church bell hung silent above them and in her heart. She wondered if the man she had saved would be the one to destroy them more, the only one left. Who could save them all? By midday, the square looked like a fort made in a hurry. Wagon beds were pulled into a circle around the well, gunny sacks stacked like a wall. Shutters were nailed shut along the adobe row. The sheriff walked the line with a quiet steadiness that calmed no one but kept hands from shaking openly. He sent 2 boys to the bell tower with a spyglass and told them to watch the ridge. He told the preacher to keep the church open for the scared and the stubborn alike. Then he came to her door and paused, hat in hand, watching the lamplight move across her floor. "You could leave," he said in a low voice. "Ride east, with the trader's wagon at sunset. The road hugs the river. Safer there." She shook her head. "Running looks like guilt. I fed a hungry man. That is all. That hungry man might be leading 100 riders," he said, but there was no bite in it. He seemed tired of the weight he carried. "You know the way of this country? Men tell stories when they're scared. Stories grow teeth." She looked past him at the churchyard, where the tracks from the raid still cut dark lines in the dust. "It was a choice," she said. "I cannot take it back. Maybe he cannot either." He studied her for a long breath, and then nodded. "If there is talking to be done when they come, it might be your voice that keeps this place standing." After he left, she went to the back field and checked the corn again. The soil was cracked, the way a palm splits when work is too hard for too long. She scraped her finger through one row and hit a dry stone. The patch would not last another month. The cattle were thin. The well had a new sound when you dropped a bucket. This was the heart of another quiet argument in the territory, one that never made speeches but pushed families to bad choices. Water, grazing land, the stubborn pride that came with each fence post. Men said they fought for honor. Too often they fought because the land was tired and gave little. Near the far fence, she found a second feather, this one plain gray and clean, tucked into a crack in the post. It was a sign without threat, a mark that said, "We see you." She wrapped it in cloth and hid it under a loose board near the hearth. Then she sat and tried to keep her breathing even. The drums were not there now. The quiet hum of the desert had a pulse she could not ignore. At dusk, a rider approached from the western draw, slow and careful, one hand raised. The boys in the bell tower rang once, and rifles lifted. The sheriff called for patience, and the rider stopped at a polite distance. It was not an Apache scout. It was a ranch hand from the river camps, a tall, thin figure with a scarf at the neck and a tired gray horse. He asked for water, thanked them, and said the same drumbeat had been heard near the canyon that led into the high country. He also carried word that the trade road had been watched all week. No wagons were taken. No cattle were scattered. It was as if a circle had been drawn around the village and left unbroken. He did not know what it meant. No one did. The preacher took that as a sign to preach. He stood in the square and spoke of judgment and mercy, of right living and righteous fear, but his voice drifted into the hot air without finding a home. The message from the canyon felt larger than any verse. It had the plain weight of a fact. Someone had put the village at the center of a map that only they could read. That night, the woman woke to a sound like a hand on the door. When she opened it, the step was empty. A small bundle lay on the ground, wrapped in rabbit skin and tied with leather. Inside, she found a plant she recognized from childhood stories, a desert herb that pulled fever from the blood. Someone was reminding her that wounds heal better when the right hands touch them. She looked up and saw a shape at the edge of the field. The Apache warrior stood there, little more than a shadow against the starlit ridge. She felt a pull to speak, to cross the distance and ask the questions burning her chest. But she knew the law of the open night. One step to fast and trust vanished like dew. Instead, she set a bowl on the step with fresh water and one heel of bread. The figure did not come closer. He lifted his hand in a small motion, not a salute, not a wave, more like a promise kept. Then he turned and walked back toward the draw, leaving a clean line of tracks. By sunrise, the patrol returned from the North Canyon with a strange report. They found a fire circle that had not burned, only a bed of stones arranged with care. In the center lay a broken iron spur, polished bright. By the marks, the sheriff guessed it belonged to the man who had thrown the first stone. Some said that proved he had been taken. Others said he had dropped it while fleeing and the riders found it later. The truth twisted in the heat like a mirage. The sheriff told the men to save their breath for work. He ordered the watch doubled and sent word to the river camps to hold steady, not to ride in armed and eager. A fast mistake could poison a long year. The woman spent the morning with a widow, 2 houses down, who had 3 small children and a fear of thunder when there were no clouds. They boiled water, baked corn cakes, and shared news the way a fence shares shade. The widow confessed that the stone thrower had once traded a sick calf for a sack of corn, and then took the corn back at night when no one watched. He had a gift for making loss feel like payment. He also had a brother in the foothills who cut timber without asking and sold it as if the trees were kin. The woman listened and felt a small shift inside. The Apache riders had not wrecked fences or taken flocks. They had marked ground, traded signs, waited. The only one who had chosen violence first was the man who now hid somewhere between village and ridge. That afternoon, the preacher's niece came to fetch water at the well and lingered a moment longer than usual. She set the bucket down and looked around with the tense curiosity of someone standing at the edge of a river she was not allowed to cross. "Is he coming back for you?" she asked. "Or for the man who hurt you?" The woman answered with care. "Maybe both. Maybe he thinks the two are tied together. Do you think so?" "I think kindness is a law that does not fit inside fences. And so is pride. Both are stronger than we think. Sometimes they ride the same horse." The girl nodded and carried the bucket away, walking more slowly than when she came, as if her feet were learning the shape of a road she had not seen before. Far from the square, inside a narrow wash thick with mesquite, the Apache camp waited. The wounded warrior sat on a flat rock while an elder tied a cleaner bandage around his shoulder. A young rider brought word of the village patrols and the shape of the wagons near the well. They spoke little. Their language rested in the pauses. The elder asked a question with a look. The warrior answered by opening his palm. In it lay a scrap of cloth torn from the woman's shawl the night of the raid, kept as proof of a bond that was not built by treaty or gun barrel. He said little about her, but his voice carried all the weight he tried to hide. To him, the village was not one place. It was a circle of choices. In one corner stood a woman who had given water without asking for a reason. In another stood a man who threw stones. The riders would not rush at random. They would carve a path that made sense to their own laws. To his kin, he said only this: the circle drawn around the settlement was meant to keep hasty hands from making the wrong kind of history back in the village. The sheriff met with 2 ranch elders in the storehouse. One wanted to gather men and strike first, take the ridge and push the riders into the lava beds where horses go lame. The other wanted to walk out with a white cloth and ask for a parley near the cottonwoods. The argument rose and fell like wind on tall grass. The sheriff listened and then chose neither. He would send 3 riders to the old mission at the river bend, a place where trade had once been fair and words held value. He would leave a sign there for anyone watching from the high country. He would ask for a meeting at noon, 2 days hence. Not a surrender, not a trap. A meeting in the open where both sides could stand without shooters hiding behind doors. When the sheriff told her of his plan, she felt both hope and dread. He asked if she would come to the mission, and stand in the open with him when the time came. He said the riders might honor a choice she had made when no one else would. She agreed, though her hands shook after he left. A child kicked inside her, a small reminder that futures are made moment by moment. Not with loud claims, but with steady steps. That night the drums sounded again, closer than before, then fell silent as if a hand had muffled them. In the churchyard, the preacher prayed aloud while a small circle of women lit a line of candles along the low wall. The glow was gentle and did not promise more than it could give. A few men watched from porches, rifles across their knees, eyes fixed on the ridge. Near midnight, a dog barked behind the storehouse, and a shadow moved toward the corral. The sheriff reached the spot in time to see a young boy, barely old enough to hold a rifle, pulling the saddle off a pony. The boy was the stone thrower's nephew, cheeks streaked with dust and fear. He meant to ride to the foothills to find his uncle, or warn him, or hide with him. It was not clear. The sheriff took the reins and crouched so his eyes were level with the boy's. He said that running would tear the wound wider. A man who had done wrong needed to face the sun, not the canyon. The boy's jaw worked. He did not cry, but his breath caught the way a branch catches when the river rises. The sheriff walked him back to his aunt's porch and left him there without a word. By morning, a thin mist rose off the river, rare as kindness in a dry month. The woman took it as a sign and gathered what little she could carry. A simple shawl, a flask of water, the gray feather. When she stepped outside, the Apache warrior was already waiting at the far edge of the field, seated on a dun horse that looked carved out of light. She walked to the fence and stood there as if the posts were altar and gate both. "I am going to the mission when the sun is high tomorrow," she said. "The sheriff will speak. I will stand with him. Will you come?" He studied her face, not for weakness, but for truth. Then he nodded once. "We will come," he said. "But others ride who answer to old anger. If they reach the mission first, words will break. Can you hold them back?" "I can try," he said. "I cannot hold every hunger." She slipped the gray feather from her shawl and tied it to the top rail. "Then meet me by this sign when the bell rings twice," she said. "If I am late, wait. If I do not come, leave the ridge. Do not give them a reason to shoot and call it law." He looked at the feather, then at her, and touched his heart in a gesture that felt older than the mission, older than the trail itself. He turned his horse and rode toward the cottonwoods, silent as anyone who knows how thin the line is between courage and ruin. By afternoon, the village was a hive of plans and worries. The preacher spoke to the elders about bringing bread and water to the mission as a sign of good faith. The ranch hands argued over who would take the watch on the east rise. The widow from 2 houses down asked if the women could come, to keep the men honest and the fear small. The sheriff said yes. The storekeeper brought out a white blanket and cut it into a square that could be tied to a pole. Under the heat, subplot took shape like a second trail branching from the main road. The stone thrower's brother rode in from the foothills with 3 men and a look that carried trouble. He swore his kin had not been taken. He claimed the riders wanted horses and iron and would use talk as a trap. He said the sheriff was a fool for meeting them in the open. Then he leaned close and told the widow that her fence stood on land his family had known since before the river changed course. And if she lost it in the coming mess, no one would help her build it back. The widow shook when he left. Fear has many uniforms. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the woman sat on her step and tried to find quiet inside the noise. She thought about the boy with the saddle, the widow with the fence, the preacher's niece with the new road in her eyes. She thought about the warrior with his careful nod, and the way desert law travels in gestures more than words. Most of all, she thought about the mission tomorrow, and how one wrong breath could turn a meeting into a burial. The sky turned the color of a clay pot pulled from a kill. A wind rose and pushed the heat down the street. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Somewhere closer, a hammer tapped a nail into a wagon bed. Then another, counting time like a drum. When night finally settled, the square went quiet except for the creak of leather and the dry rattle of mesquite. She closed her door, but did not bar it. Sleep would not come. She leaned her head on her arm and watched the moon slide past the window. In that soft light, she saw the line her life had taken since the day she set a bowl of cornmeal and a cup of water on the ground. A simple act had drawn a circle that now reached from the church bell to the cottonwoods, from her step to the ridge. Inside that circle walked fear, hunger, pride, and stubborn hope. Just before dawn, a single bell rang from the tower. Not an alarm. Not a call to gather. One clean note. The boys had seen movement on the far ridge. Riders many. They held to a straight line. Dark beads along the horizon, heading for the river bend. She stood, lifted her shawl, and stepped into the street. The sheriff joined her, followed by a small procession of villagers who looked like sleepwalkers on the road to judgment. They started toward the mission, a pale ribbon of people against the rust and gold of the desert. Behind them, in the long shadow of the church, the stone thrower's brother slid into the doorway with 2 men and a plan. It did not include bread or water or white cloth. A rifle stock knocked softly against the frame. A whispered order passed between teeth. The road to the river was not the only road being walked. At the edge of town, she looked back once and felt the weight of all the choices converging. Ahead, the mission rose white and solemn, a lonely witness in a land that studied men without blinking. The river wound around it like a long thought. She fixed her eyes on the cottonwoods beyond the bell, waiting for the figure on the dun horse. The wind shifted, and for a moment, the air carried 2 sounds at once. From the ridge, the steady rhythm of hooves. From the church, a faint click of metal. Both sounds grew, then met, then held. The day of talking had arrived. Whether it would stay as talk hung in the space between those 2 rhythms. Tight as a pulled rope, ready to snap. The road to the mission was long and dry, the kind that swallowed sound and turned footsteps into whispers. The woman walked near the front beside the sheriff, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Behind them came a handful of villagers, clutching bread, water, and quiet prayers. The church bell in the distance tolled twice, and each strike echoed through her chest like a warning. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the Apache riders were waiting. The morning air shimmered with heat rising off the sand. The horses snorted restlessly, hooves stirring thin dust that clung to the hem of her dress. She could feel every heartbeat as though the desert itself was listening. No one spoke much, but fear traveled like a second wind between them. The preacher muttered verses under his breath, and the sheriff kept his hand near his holster without meaning to. Even the wind seemed to know that the day was a tightrope, stretched between peace and ruin. When they reached the old mission, the building looked smaller than she remembered. Its white walls were cracked, and ivy crept over the bell tower. The river ran slow nearby, green and muddy, a ribbon of life cutting through the dead land. The sheriff ordered the wagons to circle near the front steps and told the people to keep low until he gave word. He planted the white cloth on a long pole beside the gate, its edges snapping in the wind, then silence. The first riders appeared on the ridge not long after. Their silhouettes moved like ghosts against the rising light, dozens of them, maybe more. The woman's heart pounded, not from fear but from recognition. One of them rode ahead of the rest, the same warrior she had fed weeks ago. He was bare-chested again, his long black hair tied back, his face painted in dark streaks of earth and ash. He carried no rifle, only a spear held upright as a sign of talk, not war. The sheriff raised his hand for the villagers to stay still. "No one fires unless fired upon," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes never left the riders. The Apache came down the slope slow and measured, hooves crunching through dry grass. When they reached the river, they stopped, lining up along the opposite bank. The warrior dismounted and walked across the shallow water, each step deliberate. He stopped a few yards from the sheriff and the woman, his gaze moving from the flag to her face. "You came," he said in rough English. "I said I would," she answered. "You came too." He nodded once, but there was no relief in it. His eyes flicked toward the crowd of villagers, the rifles glinting in the sun. Many hearts here, some afraid, some angry. "I just want to live," she said softly. He looked past her at the sheriff. "And you?" The sheriff took a step forward. We want peace, if it's still possible. The warrior's jaw tightened. Peace is not a word. It is a price. Behind them, the crowd murmured. A young man whispered to his neighbor, and the sound made the horses shift uneasily. The sheriff raised his hand again for quiet. "What do you want?" he asked. The Apache warrior looked back toward the ridge. His people watched like hawks, motionless. "The man who threw stones," he said. "He broke the law of mercy. He took from her and from us. He lives still." The woman's breath caught. The sheriff glanced at her, then at the villagers. "He's gone," he said carefully. "No one knows where." "He hides in your walls," the warrior said. "We have seen his tracks. He runs from his own shadow. If the village will not give him to us, the land will." Tension thickened in the air. The preacher stepped forward, hands trembling. "There's been enough death," he said. "Let us make right what's been done, not make more graves." The warrior's eyes softened, but his voice did not. "When a man throws stones, he builds a wall between hearts. That wall cannot stand forever." From the ridge, a sudden shout cut through the air. The Apache horses stirred, snorting and pawing at the ground. The warrior turned sharply, speaking fast in his language. The men behind him shifted formation, fanning out along the bank. The sheriff tensed, gripping his rifle. "What's happening?" the woman asked. The warrior's eyes scanned the trees. "Others come, not mine." The sheriff looked toward the road leading from the village, and his face went pale. A second group of riders appeared, armed settlers, led by the stone thrower's brother. Their horses thundered toward the mission, dust rising behind them like smoke. They hadn't come to talk. "Stay back," the sheriff shouted, but it was too late. The men didn't slow. The brother's voice rang out across the field. "You can't make peace with savages." He yelled, "They'll burn us next." The woman stepped forward, shouting for them to stop, but the roar of hooves drowned her voice. The Apache warriors turned their spears downward, readying for defense. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and dust. The sheriff swung his rifle up, his voice breaking. "Don T. fire. Hold your line." But the brother fired first. The crack of the rifle split the stillness like lightning. The bullet struck the dirt near the warrior's feet, spraying dust into the air. The warriors on the ridge cried out, charging down toward the river. The villagers screamed. Horses reared, and the woman stumbled backward as chaos erupted around her. The sheriff grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a wagon. "Stay down," he shouted. Across the water, the Apache warriors moved like a storm breaking loose. Spears glinted in the sun. Arrows arched through the air. The settlers fired back wildly, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. The white flag fell, trampled under boots and hooves. The woman crawled to the side, clutching her shawl. Smoke began to rise near the mission wall as one of the torches fell. The preacher tried to pull people toward the church doors, shouting prayers no one could hear over the gunfire. Through the smoke, she saw the warrior again, moving through the chaos, shouting orders to his people not to strike the women or children. His wound from before had reopened, blood darkening his chest. He fought to keep control, to hold back the tide. But fury had already taken hold of both sides. She saw the stone thrower's brother reload his rifle behind a water trough, aiming straight at the warrior. Her breath caught. Without thinking, she ran forward. "Stop," she cried. "Please." The man turned, startled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before he could fire, a shot rang out from behind the sheriff's rifle. The brother's gun fell from his hands as he stumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. The sheriff stood over him, smoke curling from the barrel. But it didn't stop the fight. The Apache riders reached the riverbank, splashing through the shallows. The villagers fell back toward the mission steps, dragging the wounded. The woman found herself between both sides again, her dress soaked, her heart pounding. She raised her arms high, shouting in both English and the few Apache words she remembered. "Stop. Enough." Her voice cracked through the noise. For a moment, a strange silence fell, broken only by the sound of water and breath. The warrior turned toward her, his expression torn between anger and something deeper. Behind him, his men waited, bows drawn. The sheriff stepped out from behind the wagon, lowering his rifle. "End it," he said. "We can still end it." But the moment was fragile. One spark could still break it. From inside the mission, a scream pierced the air. The widow's youngest boy had run out, searching for his mother. He stumbled into the open, tripping in the dirt. The woman gasped and rushed forward, reaching for him, and then, from the ridge, another gunshot. The boy froze. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, and every heart stopped. The smoke cleared slowly, the world holding its breath. The warrior's face went pale. His men raised their weapons again. The sheriff looked to the ridge, eyes narrowing. But the shooter was hidden in shadow. No one knew whose bullet had been fired or who it had struck. The woman turned. Horror filling her chest, her voice breaking through the heavy silence. "Who fired?" she cried. No one answered. The riders tensed. The settlers reloaded, and the mission stood between them, its old white walls trembling under the weight of history repeating itself. The sun burned red above the desert, and the air seemed to hum with the sound of hearts beating faster, waiting for the moment that would decide if mercy still had a place in this land, or if vengeance would finally claim it. The sheriff's finger hovered near the trigger. The Apache warrior raised his hand. The woman stood between them, breath shallow, eyes on both sides. And then, somewhere in the distance, another drum began to beat, low, steady, like thunder rolling toward them. The drumbeat rolled like thunder, shaking the ground and hearts alike. Dust lifted in small clouds around the mission as both sides froze, their weapons half-raised, waiting to see who would make the next move. The woman stood still between them, her hands trembling but held high, her shawl torn by wind and fear. For a moment, it felt as if time itself held its breath over that patch of desert. Then the boy who had run from the church whimpered. He was alive, only scraped, lying behind a fallen bucket. The sound snapped everyone out of their trance, but it did not bring calm. The warriors on the ridge moved first, their horses shifting as the steady drumbeat grew louder. From the canyon behind them came another group of riders, slower and older, their faces marked with white clay. They were the elders of the Apache band, the ones who carried judgment in their silence. The younger warriors turned toward them, their energy caught between anger and obedience. The wounded warrior, still standing near the woman, raised his spear high and called out in his language. His words carried across the river like a wind breaking through smoke. The elders halted, watching the scene unfold. The sheriff saw his chance. He lowered his rifle, slowly, and raised both hands. "No one else needs to die here," he said, his voice loud enough for both sides. "Not today." The woman's heart pounded as she looked toward the ridge. She could see the confusion in the younger riders, their anger dimming as the drumbeat softened. The Apache elder at the front dismounted, his long braids falling over his shoulders, his eyes steady as stone. He crossed the river and stood beside the wounded warrior, his gaze sweeping over the broken white flag, the guns, the terrified villagers. "You brought blood to talk," he said in his deep, even voice. The sheriff bowed his head slightly. "We didn't start it." The elder looked toward the fallen man near the wagon, the brother of the stone thrower. His chest rose weakly, a red stain spreading on his shirt. "No," the elder said, "but you kept it alive." The woman stepped forward, clutching her shawl. "Please," she said. "The one who threw stones, he began this. The rest were just afraid. If there's to be punishment, let it be for him, not for all." The elder's gaze shifted to her, and something softened behind his stern eyes. "You fed one of ours," he said. "You knew what that meant." She nodded. "I only did what I thought was right." The elder turned to the wounded warrior, speaking in their tongue. The man's shoulders lowered. Whatever storm burned in him seemed to fade beneath the elder's calm tone. After a long pause, the elder looked back at the sheriff. "You will find the man who began this," he said. "When you do, let him face what he made. Not us. Not you. The land will take him." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed." The air loosened, though the tension still hummed under it like a struck wire. The elders signaled the riders on the ridge, and slowly, one by one, they began to turn their horses away. The warriors followed, silent but watchful, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The woman fell to her knees, tears welling as the weight of it all pressed down on her. The sheriff helped her up, his voice soft. "You did more than any of us could. You stopped a war." She shook her head. "No, they stopped it. I just reminded them what it costs." The preacher and the others came out from the church, faces pale and tired. The boy was safe, the wounded were tended, and the mission stood, though its walls were scarred. The people gathered their dead and buried them by the river before sundown. The woman watched in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the riders had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and the desert grew quiet again. The fields were rebuilt, the fences mended, though the scars in the earth and hearts remained. The story spread across the territory, told in whispers first, and then in full voices. Some said the Apache had come to destroy the village, but left in peace because a woman's courage stopped them. Others said they left because they found honor where they expected hate. No one ever found the man who threw the first stone. His brother's body was buried beside the mission wall, and the people said justice had already been done. Sometimes, at dawn, the woman would see tracks in the sand near her field, hoofprints that led toward the mountains and disappeared among the rocks. She knew who left them, and she never spoke of it. The sheriff rode to her home once before winter. He brought her a small bundle, a piece of pottery wrapped in hide. Inside was a feather tied with red thread, the same kind she had found before. "They sent this," he said. "Said it means the circle is closed." She smiled faintly and placed it beside her window. "Maybe one day the land will forget," she said. He looked at the horizon, the line of the mountains cutting through the sky. "The land remembers everything," he said. "But sometimes it forgives." When spring came, the rains finally returned. The river swelled, filling the cracks in the dry soil. The cornfield that had once been nothing but dust began to grow again. Children played in the square without fear, and the church bell rang for weddings instead of warnings. The woman spent her mornings by the well, the same one where everything had begun. She often thought of the Apache warrior, the way his eyes had carried both pain and patience, the way he had turned away instead of striking back. She wondered if he ever thought of her, or if he too was trying to forget the day kindness almost turned into ruin. One morning she went to draw water and found something resting on the edge of the well, a small wooden carving of a bird. Its wings were spread wide, one feather missing. She touched it gently, knowing who had left it. It wasn't a message of love or farewell. It was something quieter and understanding, a sign that peace, however fragile, had taken root in the same soil that once tasted blood. She looked toward the horizon, the wind tugging at her shawl. The mountains were blue and still, and for the first time in months, she felt no fear of what lay beyond them. The world was harsh, but not heartless. The land could wound, but it could also heal. When the sun dipped low, casting gold across the valley, she whispered a prayer for the man who had thrown stones, for the warrior who had shown mercy, and for the unborn child who would grow up in a land that had learned, at least for a time, to listen before it struck. That night the village gathered around the square for the first time since the raid. The preacher spoke softly of forgiveness and courage, but it was the woman who people looked to. They didn't speak of her kindness as weakness anymore. They spoke of it as the reason they were still alive, as the stars rose over the desert. She stood quietly by the fire, feeling the warmth on her face. Somewhere far off, a lone horse neighed, and she smiled, knowing the desert was watching over them all in the distance. The drums returned not of war, but of celebration, faint and steady, echoing across the hills like the heartbeat of a land that had finally remembered mercy. The woman looked up at the sky, whispering the same words she had said that first day by the well. "We're all hungry for something. I just chose to feed what could still live." The wind carried her words into the night, across the quiet river and over the sleeping land. The story that began with a bowl of food and a thrown stone ended there with peace that was fragile but real, born not from victory, but from understanding. And in that silence that followed, The world seemed to breathe again, as if the desert itself had finally found rest.